Okay, so now I want to talk about the complexities of conservation. Much like public lands that we spoke about last week, conservation of species is always a political activity, at least to some degree. Political in the sense that anthropologists mean the term, by which we would say power dynamics, right? It involves some kind of power dynamics between human beings, whether that's a shared social power of a group of people together deciding we will not over-harvest a species, and we will punish people that go against that, as in the Fekrit-Burks reading, The Benefit of the Commons, where they talk about Maine lobstermen sort of setting rules of not overusing the resource and then intentionally shutting out or vandalizing folks that don't follow those rules. So that's a political act, right? A shared power arrangement that then is being used towards conservation ends. Or whether it's top-down conservation, a government coming in and saying this is an endangered species, we are recognizing it as such, people are not allowed to kill this species, as with something like bald eagles, right? When bald eagles were placed on the endangered species list. So conservation then is always a political act, and also to some degree always a cultural act, because as our preceding conversation suggests, we are making culturally informed decisions about what species matter, to what degree, why, and also what does it mean to save a species, right? What does it mean to conserve a species? What should that look like when we say that we want to save a whale, or save a wolf, or save sago palms, or save X ecosystem? What is it we mean by that? What does it mean to save something? And I don't just mean like, oh, who are humans to think that we can save things? Because from my point of view, if we're the one anti-saving them, we should definitely be the one saving. But I more mean like, what's our benchmark there? That's ultimately partly a scientific question, but also partly a cultural question of at what point do we say a species is saved, right? What does that mean? Does that mean the same population that it always had prior to the Industrial Revolution? If so, I'm afraid we will not be able to save certain kinds of species at all. Does it mean a healthy population that will continue into the indefinite future? Okay, that viable population, as we sometimes say. Does it mean the species viable but also spread out over many parts of its range, right? Because in theory you could have a viable species but not have it present in many of the places it used to be present. American bison are an excellent example of this, right? They're viable, we're keeping them alive, but in very small chunks of and pockets of land. And so what do we mean, right? Another set of questions to ask is, who are conservationists? Who are working to save species? What alliances and sometimes unexpected alliances happen in the cultural dynamics and political dynamics of the conservation world? And what kinds of effects does that have for what conservation actually looks like? So let's talk about that for a moment. So I want to talk about two groups that may or may not typically be the first thing you think of when you think of wildlife conservationists, which are hunters and then zoo owners. So two types of activities, hunting and zoos. Hunting, I used to give this lecture or a version of it in North Texas, where hunting was a lot less common, particularly in the city we lived. And so saying like, oh, hunting is like super conservationist for wildlife would be like more shocking to students. Here in Alaska, of course, tons of people actively participate in hunting and fishing, and so the idea of hunters as people that are actively looking after or thinking about or wanting the protection of wildlife species would not be at all surprising. So it's a bit of a less punchy lecture now that I work in Alaska than when I worked in North Texas. Nonetheless, there are some aspects of hunting and conservation that you may not have thought of that are really interesting. One of which is the complex sort of political and cultural entanglements between hunting and the wildlife agencies that do a lot of the endangered species and conservation work here. So hunting in the U.S. has a really fascinating history. So in the 1800s, we were still in a time period where tons and tons of people hunted, right? Hunting would have been extremely widespread. And not only that, but we still had a large degree of commercial hunting, by which I mean sale of wild game in like markets, right? People like in large cities and stuff, like selling wildlife that they'd hunted. That's obviously something you see a lot less of nowadays. You obviously can go to places where you can buy wild game, but it's a lot less common, obviously, than it used to be. And so, commercial hunting, as well as sort of private hunting, and just people just hunting to make a living, right? Hunting as part of a economic strategy of, early Americans, especially in quote frontier areas, where it would have been hunting as well as farming, as well as some wage labor, right? Hunting was just kind of part of the mix of putting food on the table. Over time in the 1800s, you started to see the rise of sort of a movement of people that were against commercial hunting, but also often against sort of small scale, just Joe Rando who regularly hunts to put food on their table, goes out, every few weeks to hunt something, and starting to call this like pot hunting and disparage it. And at the same time, and connected to that same movement of people started to talk about sort of the sportsman's code, the idea, and yes, if that sounds gendered, it was at the time, but the idea that hunters should follow a sort of gentlemanly code of ethics for how one hunted. And that code of ethics involved a lot of different things that nowadays for many hunters seem like common sense, seem like just part of the way the world is, but is really kind of a social construction, is a part of very specific ideas arising in the 1800s. So for example, the idea is that you shouldn't kill female animals if you can avoid it, that you should instead go after bucks or males of the species. Obviously you can't typically tell with a fish, but you can tell with a deer most of the time. You can tell with the moose, and so the idea that you should be hunting the males rather than the females or the babies. Partly that was conservation oriented, right? The idea that killing female deer has a much bigger impact than killing male deer, since female deer have a limited reproductive potential, right? They can only have so many children, but a male deer can impregnate many female deer. So killing a male deer has a lot less effect on the species than killing a female deer, all things being equal, at least with animals that are promiscuous or polygynous, which is many of the animals that we hunt. So that was partly made sense scientifically, but it's also clear that there was sort of this like gendered nature to it, right? That people sort of didn't like the idea of killing does, that seemed sort of unethical, to go after female deer, at a time when it's hard to imagine perhaps now, because deer have made big rebounds in a lot of parts of the US, but at a time where many deer species were really struggling because of overhunting. You also had other ideas, like the idea of fair chase, the idea that it should be possible in theory for the animal to escape. And so that's one of the reasons why, for certain kinds of species, there's certain kinds of laws about what you can or can't do, right? You can't spotlight, you can't shoot out of your car, things like that, right? You can't shoot out of a helicopter. The idea that wildlife are supposed to have a fair chance to escape. Now that idea doesn't make a lot of sense if you're a mid-1800s subsistence hunter just trying to put food on the table. You don't want the animal to get away. But a lot of the people that were pushing these ideas were people that were sort of middle class and upper class kind of sports hunters, a group of people that had arisen in the mid-1800s that no longer had to hunt to make a living, right? They had other kinds of jobs, but hunting was a hobby. Hunting was something you did out in the woods every once in a while, and it was something to be done properly and gentlemanly. And so two very different types of needs for hunting, and to some degree, those middle-class, upper-class farmers were the ones who won the day. They ended up getting some important conservation laws passed, like the Laci Act, which was kind of our first anti-poaching law, well, one of our first anti-poaching laws, that basically said you can't sell illegally caught meat. It shut down a lot of those like kind of wildlife markets or wild meat markets that I was telling you about. But also, and it also cut down a lot on what a big thing at the time was hunting wildlife for their feathers, right? For women's fashion, for women's hats and things, as well as furs. Obviously, a lot more fur hunting at that point. So these kind of sportsman's codes types, these new hunters, they were part of the movement that got about some of these important changes that did help save a lot of wild species in the US, which was really important. The other thing, though, is that we ended up getting sort of these cultural class overtones to wildlife laws that reflect a particular cultural politics that's no longer obvious 120 years later, but was very much a product of different people arguing, different classes of people arguing over what hunting should be, quote unquote, which is ultimately, again, a cultural question. And you see that in a lot of the hunting laws that got passed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So things like bag limits, right? Only X amount of animals, which makes sense, right? But also things like, again, you can't hunt out of a vehicle, or things like you can't spotlight an animal that later got passed, or things like you can't hunt does of certain species, or you can only hunt does under very specific conditions. That also sort of, and even to the degree that some of that didn't actually make its way into law, they sort of won the culture war in the sense that it made its way into how many hunters thought about hunting in the US, especially in the lower 48, where it tends to be less of an overtly subsistence activity and more of a recreational activity, even if people are hunting the meat, right? A lot of times it's typically not a main income. So much so, right, that line of thinking became so hegemonic in the United States that, for example, I was raised in a deer hunting family and an elk hunting family, and I would have, at the time as a kid, based on how my dad taught me, thought it unthinkable to kill a doe. That somebody that did that, whether it was legal or not, was doing something terrible. And so these ideas very much became a part of sort of hunting culture in much of the lower 48 United States and in other places as well. So that's an interesting aspect of sort of hunting in the U.S. Another interesting aspect of hunting in the U.S., and this is something that Iris Braverman, who you read a bit from, that she talks about in another one of her articles, hunting became part of how conservation gets funded in the U.S. And so there was a few different laws that were passed in around the 1920s, 30s. One of them was what's called the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act of 1934. So if you've ever hunted wildfowl, if you've ever hunted like duck or something like that, or what you've noticed is that you have to buy like a duck stamp, quote unquote. It's obviously not just for ducks, but a duck stamp. And the money that raises, it's something in addition to your hunting license. The money that duck stamp raises goes directly towards a migratory bird conservation fund that Congress runs and mostly gives over to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who mostly uses it to buy up bird habitat, to buy up wetlands and turn them into wildlife refuges. Now that's notable in a lot of ways, including the fact that the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, is also the ones that basically are one of the major players in running the Endangered Species Act. So a lot of the money for wildlife conservation, including habitat conservation that can sometimes help endangered species, comes about from duck hunting. So I will tell you, as somebody that comes from Oregon, where the environmental politics are very different than Alaska, that there are a lot of people in places like Oregon who would think of themselves as very environmentalist and would never think of hunting. That hunting would be seen as very, very bad. Even if one eats meat from industrial agriculture, that hunting is seen as sort of abhorrent, and why would you make sport of killing an animal? And yet, in the U.S., killing animals in a very direct way funds saving of animals. Killing of animals through hunting helps fund the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's not the only thing that does, but it's one of the things. That money by law goes mostly to wetlands preservation. 6 million acres of it have been protected due to revenue from the Stamp Act since its inception, about $800 million. So that's a whole lot of protected wetlands and a whole lot of alive migratory birds today because of people that kill birds and pay to kill those birds, pay the government to kill those birds. The cultural politics of that are very interesting. For me, not very problematic as somebody that grew up in a hunting family, but for a lot of people, that's something that surprises them to learn. It's kind of a strange bedfellows, right? The people that are hunting the animals and the ones that are actively choosing to serve them or save them as wildlife rangers. That also, though, raises a critique, right? A concern or a critique that some people raise is that if wildlife agencies get a lot of their revenue from hunting, that they will then be overly beholden to hunting interests and therefore prioritize conserving, for example, ducks and deer over random endangered mouse or random endangered frog, right? Because sometimes something might be a good conservation move for a hunted species and not for another species. As a simple example, when I lived in Utah, they were setting up like what do you call them? Like troughs of water, basically, to help out introduced wildfowl. Not non-native, really, wildlife that were native to the general region, but not that specific like piece of habitat, like introducing turkey into a place that wild turkey haven't been, and then trying to think through like how to best help the turkey population, which, you know, if you're kind of a purist about wildlife conservation, you're like, why are we trying to help turkey, right? If a turkey's not native to that specific shrubland, and the answer partly is, well, if it's something that hunters favor, it's potentially something that wildlife agencies in a state are going to take seriously, partly because there's close relationships between wildlife agencies and hunting groups, not just because of the funding, but for a lot of other reasons as well. A lot of times hunters have set up private hunting and wildlife NGOs like Ducks Unlimited, or in the fishing world, Trout Unlimited, which directly give money to habitat conservation. So you have these kind of interesting, strange bedfellows, and a possible critique is that it leads to, in a world where we don't have unlimited funds and time and money, kind of a skewed focus on certain species over others. I don't know that I agree with that critique, but it is an interesting critique, and it brings up the cultural politics here. And, you know, it's a cultural question whether that's a problem or not. Is that a problem to focus the most on the species that humans are most dependent on? Maybe that's not a problem. Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937 is another law that does something very similarly, but it's broader. It's a tax on essentially all firearms, most firearms and ammo. You get a tax whether you would see that on, I don't think you actually see it on your receipt. Well, maybe you do. Been a long time since I've bought ammo. But anyways, you wouldn't probably see it called Pittman-Robertson tax. It'd be called something different. But it was a law that was passed in 1937 that taxes firearms and ammo and different kinds of things and puts it towards state wildlife agencies. So like Alaska Department of Fish and Game, for example. And over the years has produced $7 billion for state fish and game, which of course do a lot of other kinds of conservation other than just managing the game species, although that's sort of how fish and game agencies started, was, hey, let's manage the hunting and fishing species to make sure that we still have them in 50 years. Over time, their roles have evolved, and so nowadays you can go over to ADF&G and, you know, as I did one time, ask, hey, what's this species in my yard? Is this an invasive species? And they'll have their, you know, insect expert come and give you an opinion, right? So they do a lot of things now other than manage fish and game that are actively being hunted or fished. So it's interesting, right? Conservation is really heavily funded in certain areas through hunting, through arguably the killing of animals helps save animals. So it's an interesting connection there. You see that also in various parts of Africa, to use an example not from the US, where you have big wildlife safari parks where basically people from a variety of countries come and pay a lot of money to go and hunt legally, usually megafauna. So hunt some of our more abundant large animals. And then that is something that's very controversial back at home, as you may be aware, right? That can be very politically damaging if a picture surfaces sometimes of a politician going and having poached, or no, sorry, not poached, because it wouldn't be poaching, but having hunted, right, these large animals. And yet some of those wildlife safari parks, some of them are very deeply problematic. Others are where we have a lot of our last remaining populations of certain wild animals, and they're being sort of managed partly through private hands. So there's complex cultural politics there when it comes to saving species, definitely. Another example, just to make this even more kind of complex and interesting, is when we use hunting as a form of wildlife management. And I put management in quotes because management is itself a very cultural idea that we should or could manage wild species, which other ontologies including many indigenous ontologies, would say, these are our relatives or these are spiritual entities. The idea of management might seem kind of weird from certain cultural backgrounds, although other people would be perfectly fine with it, even in those cultural contexts. But anyways, deer management through hunting is an interesting thing. So in New York State, they have a problem not so much with too few deer, at least in the central part of the state, as well as New York City part of the state, but too many deer. That's for a variety of reasons. A lot of cities have passed no hunting laws where you can't hunt very close to the city, which makes sense for a variety of reasons, but essentially what that sets up is all sorts of deer refuges in the many, many small to mid-sized towns scattered throughout central New York. It's basically like a wildlife sanctuary that's not only can hunters not be in, but also deer come by and like nibble on people's ornamental plants and stuff. Like people are growing a bunch of flowers in their yard, as they often do. I've spent a lot of time in western upstate New York. People love growing their flowers up there. And, deer love it too. Just come right along. It's a nice little snack. So great for the deer, right? And so deer populations have skyrocketed in New York at the same time as human populations have increased, of course. And that causes a variety of problems. And so Fish and Game out there actually want to reduce the deer population in certain areas. That might seem astounding in places like Alaska, where we're actively thinking about how do we help save a species like salmons, various salmon species. But here the concern is too much wildlife that are overpopulating. Well, what does overpopulating mean, right? The deer don't see themselves as overpopulating. That's a human-centered, cultural-centered perspective. What they mean by that, among other things, is that it causes deer traffic fatalities, cars running into deer, which can often damage the car. It's not like moose up here where that potentially hurts the human typically, although it could, especially if somebody's swerving to avoid the deer or something, or if it hits it just right. But yeah, deer-human collisions, and obviously, most humans that hit a deer don't feel great about it, so it's a situation that a lot of residents of New York would like to see changed, but changed logically means there needs to be fewer deer, since there's not a very effective way to tell a deer to not go on roads. And short of just putting up more signs that say, hey, watch out for deer, which help to some degree, we don't have a lot of options. So one of the options is decreasing the population. The other reason is because deer, some people feel, carry ticks, and ticks carry Lyme disease. And Lyme disease can be a very, very serious issue, as you're no doubt aware. A chronic issue for people that get Lyme disease. And so for those reasons, as well as other things, like deer munching on people's flowers, in a lot of areas of a lot of New York communities, they'd like to see there be fewer deer, and wildlife agents in the area try to make that happen, bring them down to a level that seems more comfortable for humans, maybe seems more comparable to historic levels, because there's a fourth factor I haven't mentioned in why there's are quote-unquote too many deer in New York, and that's that we removed the natural predators other than ourselves. We removed wolves. And so as a result of, about 200 years of that, lo and behold, deer have skyrocketed. So an attempt to bring them back down to natural levels. And so the wildlife agents do that in a variety of different ways, one of the biggest of which is that they put out a bunch of Doe Tags, basically is what you would call them. They've got a fancier name than that, but basically going back on this like ages old thing in many states where many states don't allow doe hunting or only very limited case, and here, allowing it and in fact actively encouraging it, sort of flooding the hunting market with like, if you didn't get a buck tag, well, here's like 3 doe tags, right? Trying to actively get hunters to kill does, because that will have a much bigger effect on the population than killing a buck, when one buck again can impregnate, let's say, 10 deer females. The problem being that for those cultural reasons that we've talked about, many hunters don't want to hunt doe. They view that as unethical. Or there's also the trophy hunting side of it. People want a rack that they can put up on their wall. And so for what are really purely subjective reasons, cultural reasons, socially constructed reasons, is very hard to get hunters to hunt does. But some people do, and they're part of that strategy. If they can't get hunters to do it, what they'll sometimes, or if they're in cities where hunting is not allowed, what they often end up resorting to is things like hiring sharpshooters, which has happened a few times in New York, basically hiring private hunting. So cities say, oh, no hunters here, and also no wolves here, was something New York said a very long time ago, and also no hunters here. We don't want that in city limits. But then what ends up happening is sometimes they have to hire sharpshooters, right? One person to come and kill the deer, and maybe give the meat to something like a homeless shelter, and maybe not. Maybe some of it goes to waste, which is arguably something of a tragedy. Or, you have efforts to try to develop contraceptives that you can shoot into deer. There's experiments going on with that. Giving the deer basically a vaccination against fertility, an injected contraceptive, an injected birth control. But that's not the easiest because you have to shoot them with a tranquilizer or just otherwise catch them and then tranquilize them. Not easy, very expensive. So you have a situation here where, of course, the simplest and most straightforward thing to do would be to have what nature already did, which would be to have an animal that's hunting it constantly. Because another issue with hunters, trying to use hunters to keep the population down, is that a hunter maybe wants 2 or 3 deer, right? It's usually recreational hunting in New York. And so if the state would like hunters to hunt 5, 6, 7 deer to try to bring the numbers down. People don't want that many deer. You can give them all the tags they want. You can't make people hunt if they don't want to hunt. What would be easier is to have deer in the area, or indigenous communities that were displaced that traditionally used subsistence hunting, if that had never been disrupted. But instead what we now have is a situation where instead most people are sports hunters, wild predation is gone, subsistence hunting for the most part is gone, and therefore you have a state agency trying to bring back down wildlife using a lot of sort of odd indirect ways, trying to use hunters, but getting sort of some degree of cultural pushback. Man, fascinating politics, fascinating cultural dynamics going on there.